What is going on YouTube fam, boys and girls? Welcome back to my channel, and in this video we're going to be touching on the whole concept that is diet breaks, or also known as deficit breaks. And they are exactly that, a break from you just grinding away, eating in a calorie deficit, and basically boosting all things internal to make them all functioning well, and just to give you a mental health a break and all that sort of shit. So we're going to be diving deep into basically the science behind these, who should sort of be using them, but then also a timeline in terms of an example of how to approach them if you are to introduce them into your fat loss journey. Because truth be told, when it comes to losing fat, your goal shouldn't be to just grind hard and undereat and over exercise and stuff like that, because when it comes to conventional dieting, that is exactly that. That's exactly what people do. They undereat, they over exercise, they do excessive cardio, they use all sorts of different supplements to try and suppress appetite and to be able to hashtag boost metabolism and stuff like that. And all that this causes is damage, and it makes fat loss incredibly difficult to achieve. So strap yourself in for all sorts of sick insights over this video, and obviously when it comes to this, just be aware that like if you are new to the game of fat loss and just body transformation and stuff like that, this probably isn't necessarily going to be entirely relevant to you. If I were you, I'd probably just be focusing on trying to get more consistency in terms of getting in protein and plants and water and sleeping more and stuff like that. But if you've already got all those bases covered and you've got a little bit of experience with tracking macros and calories, well then strap yourself in, because this is going to be entirely relevant for you. And on with the content, let's bring on the knowledge. So first thing we're going to be looking at, fam, is basically the periodization of how to and where to include diet breaks if your goal is to basically be dominating fat loss and make things a bit more enjoyable and the adherence game a bit more easier too. So to help illustrate this, I've fired up my iPad, which we're going to jump into just now. And as you'll see here, we've got a bit of a timeline graph scenario going on, because hashtag science. And for those of you who are visual learners like me, this is going to help it to all make sense, all right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to use a female in this example, all right? So over here you'll see we've got calories up the side, and then we've got a timeline, right? So typically, like when an average Joe, average Jane is approaching fat loss, like depending on their history prior to starting, will usually determine whether they should actually jump into a deficit straight away or not. Some people actually would benefit from just cruising in like a reverse diet fashion straight up to maintenance intake, eating there for a while, and then this stuff kicks in. Because obviously what you got to keep in mind is that if you've already been a conventional dieter, jumping from diet to diet in the past and that sort of thing, right? Well then kind of what happens is that because you're so used to being in a deficit, right? Your body obviously, through the process of adaptive thermogenesis, adapts to this, and therefore what happens is that your everything down regulates to try and keep you safe and stop self-destruction. And your overall energy expenditure will decrease, your overall thyroid and metabolism will decrease, everything kind of decreases, making it harder and harder to be able to have any chance at sticking to the calories that you're eating. And this is where disordered eating and binge eating and stuff like that can occur. So we're going to use the example here of someone who has not kind of fucked themselves that way and is in a fairly healthy sort of scenario, and they're looking to approach fat loss properly and kind of have a macro point of view in terms of what it could look like. So let's say that in this sort of scenario, the average chick, their maintenance might be over here at 2400 to start with, right? Actually, know what I'll do is I'll go like this, and that'll make it actually straighter. So we'll go like this, 2400. There we go. So we're going to presume that that is their perceived maintenance, right? Or kick-off maintenance. Now, if you're not aware of what maintenance means, it's basically, maintenance, there we go. It's basically exactly that, maintenance, the amount of calories that your body needs to be able to maintain the weight that you have. And naturally, to be able to start losing weight or fat to any sort of degree, you need to be in what's known as a calorie deficit. So usually 10 to 20% calories below that perceived maintenance, because obviously when it comes to energy in versus energy out, if you are eating the same amount of energy that your body is actually burning, well then that's maintenance. If you're eating more calories than your body requires to maintain your current weight, that's called eating in a surplus. So naturally, because this is geared towards fat loss, what we want to do, if someone's perceived maintenance in terms of kicking off, and you can also refer to this as TDEE, so total daily energy expenditure, right? So let's say that starting off, someone is basically kicking off and they're going to be eating, let's say, 20% below their maintenance. So that means 240 times, 10% would be 240, so therefore 480. So they're going to roughly be at around, or just below 2,000 calories basically. So what that will mean here, right, is if we go like this, so they've got their first scenario, so first kickoff will be at around that 2,000 mark, right? Now, how to approach kicking off is basically like, unless you've got a contest prep coming up and that sort of thing, right? You should really, if like ideally possible, be having a diet break every 4 to 8 weeks or so, depending on how much fat you have to lose. And obviously, if you've got like a contest, like a bodybuilding competition coming up or all that sort of thing, well, you need to be a bit more, like kind of on point, if you will, because, well, you've got a deadline in mind, right? So in this sort of case, we're going to presume that that isn't happening, and that you are basically, you've got time on your side and you want to do things properly and you want to smash it effectively, right? So what that would mean, right, is that your initial sort of period would be, let's say, actually we're going to get rid of this so we can make it a bit more easier. Let's say that you are adhering to your deficit, but what's happened is basically you started at 2K, right? And for the first 5 weeks, you really shouldn't be changing your calories unless you've seen sort of like 3 weeks of just staying the same weight or it going in the wrong way or whatever. So let's say, for example, that you had, just only very, very, very small, minute weight drops, maybe like 100 grams or whatever. So therefore you drop your intake to 1900, right? So this is your first 5 weeks in a deficit, right? Now, believe it or not, what's actually been proven in studies, and like me, when it comes to this sort of knowledge, like I came across, things like reverse dieting and things like refeeds and things like, diet breaks from the wizard himself, Eric Helms. And then obviously learned more about it in more depth when I got my sports nutritionist certs at the end of 2018. And what's absolutely fantastic in terms of what studies have proven, right, is that there was a comparison group in terms of a group of people who used diet breaks and regularly, ate at maintenance versus people who just dieted hard for the same period of time. And the results were the same. So I don't know about you, but if I, could achieve the same, if not better results through eating more, well then naturally, like, who doesn't want to eat more, right? So back to the scenario here. So the first 5 weeks in a deficit have basically been, smashed out. And then what you want to be doing basically in terms of the actual diet break itself is you want to have 1 to 2 weeks of eating basically in between 300 to 600 calories more than whatever you're currently eating in terms of in a deficit. So in these 5 weeks in a deficit, let's presume that you're tracking macros, right? Tracking macros, right? So in other words, you're tracking protein, carbs and fat, and you're being diligent with your intake. Then let's say that because this is your first one, you are going to milk it and you're going to go for 1 week strong, right? So let's say that you, as I said before, you want to eat between 300 to 600 extra calories on top of whatever your existing intake was. So let's say that because you're at 1900 here in terms of your current point eating in a deficit, you're adding an extra, let's kind of go right between and say that you're going to eat an extra 500, right? So basically here, you're 1900, adding an extra 500, so you are back at this intake here, right? So we'll put in here, we're going to flip it so that I can actually see what's going on. We'll put here, diet, break, 1 week. Now, note here as well that when it comes to diet breaks, you don't want to be dialing in on tracking macros specifically to the T. If I were you, like, in favor of being able to give your mental health a bit of a break, like, you're still going to be tracking, but if I were you, I would be focusing on tracking, we'll put just in here, focus on tracking protein, focus on tracking fiber, and also focus on tracking calories. So that way, basically what's going to go on is that you will, like it's just going to allow you a bit more flexibility in your food choices, and it's going to make adhering to the overall calories an extra bit easier as well. All right. So basically what happens is that after you've had a diet break, well, it's time to enter back into a deficit again. Now, because we're jumping back into a deficit, essentially all you're doing is you're just returning back to whatever your intake was before. So in that case, because it's 1900, you basically are going to return back into a deficit again. As I said, like you're going to do it for, between 4 to 8 week block. So because we did 5 weeks before, everything was trending well. Let's say that you're going to do it for another 6 week block, right? So you're at week 6 here, therefore your deficit is going to finish here. Now, what's probably going to likely happen, I'd imagine, is that you are going to experience this sort of scenario again, where you started the deficit up here at 1900, but then naturally whenever I am sort of like reducing someone's calories, like when need be, because what will usually happen is that when you've had a diet break, yes, you are increasing calories and stuff like that, and understand that it's normal to either drop a bit of fat or to maintain weight or to gain a little bit of weight. It's all normal. Because what's happening here, you got to remember, right, is that you're likely going to be increasing your intake of carbs, so therefore you're going to be increasing, in terms of water retention and stuff like that. But because what I typically prescribe is that when someone has a diet break, we get them to not stress about cardio, just enjoy training, usually take a bit of a deload more often than not. So that way we can reduce cortisol levels as well, which are typically high when someone is actually dieting. Because what you got to remember is that when you're in a deficit, right, what's actually happening here is that you are placing stress on your body, right? And it's just because like our bodies have a process called homeostasis, right? So in other words, that's basically a process that is there to stop our self-destruction, to keep us safe. So naturally what happens is that, well, your body picks up on the fact that you're in a deficit, that you're putting stress on it, so therefore it will try to adapt to what's happening and therefore reduce your overall energy expenditure, which means that for you to keep dropping body fat, you're also going to have to, in relation to that expenditure that's reducing, match it by gradually eating less. So therefore at the start here, your intake might be 1900, right? And you'll get some results for a little while, and then naturally you're going to probably need to, because it's the start of the deficit and you've come out of that diet break, you'll be able to lose any water weight that you gained very quickly anyway, because you're back into a deficit and that sort of thing. But what's going to happen is that your overall energy is going to need to drop. And let's say, for example, that you might be finishing this period on 1800, right? Which isn't really too bad, because basically you started at 2K, you're dropping fat, you've now finished this 6 week period in a deficit. So let's say 6 weeks in a deficit, so you've finished that, right? And then that's been finished, that's awesome. Now it's time to have a diet break again. And because obviously you're working in a manner where you are going to be eating back at whatever perceived maintenance is, right? In this case, we're going to be increasing calories by 500 again. So in this sort of case though, 500 on top of 1800 will equal 2300. So that means we're going to be up at about here. Yep, 2300. We're going to smash it for a week, right? As I said before, like depending on the timeline you're playing with, you can be obviously having a diet break for 1 to 2 weeks. But let's say here that you're doing diet break for 1 week, right? Diet break 1 week. Awesome. As I said before, when you're having your diet breaks, it's a means of really just using it to be able to get more variety in your food intake, get more variety in your food choices, track calories, track protein, track fiber, enjoy training, that sort of stuff, because obviously then when it comes to returning back to a deficit, we're going to go back into probably a 5 or 6 week block again, depending on obviously someone's timeline. Now you will start back at your 1800 again, so 13, so the deficit is going to finish roughly at about here, and now you're probably going to be roughly at about there. So there we go, we've got a deficit block again, so we've got a 5 week block this time. Now as you can imagine as well, right, what's going to happen is that when you are returning back into these deficit blocks, what you're probably going to find is that hunger will increase. Now, why this is because, well, naturally, as you diet, something called leptin levels get reduced. And that's just simply because, well, when you are in a deficit, and obviously diet breaks help to combat the effect of this happening, but basically what will happen is that your body is going to play with some of your hormones to get you to be more hungry so that you consume way more food and basically store fat again. Because you got to remember that it just wants to keep you safe. It doesn't want you to be lean. It would much rather that you have fat and then just, cruise along, right? So as a means to help combat hunger, given that you're still eating, towards some targets of getting lean, if I were you, this is where I would up the intake of satiating based foods. So this is where you can be increasing fiber intake by a bit. This is where you can be increasing protein intake by a bit. Stocking up on basically nutrient dense foods. So you might have been back here when you were starting, you might have been on a, let's say for example, like 70-30 based approach to your calories. So 70% dedicated to nutrient dense, 30% dedicated to nutrient poor. But then by this stage, because you're looking to maximize your calories more, because you were on 1800, right? And then now you might be on, let's say, 1650, right? Obviously, to maximize these calories more, you might take a 90-10 approach, meaning 90% of your calories are nutrient dense, 10% are nutrient poor. And notice how I said that as opposed to good and bad or clean and junk. And that's because the worst thing that you want to do here is to box yourself into any sort of restriction and therefore, open yourself up for disordered eating or binging and that sort of thing. All right. So we've just finished the end of this third block of being in a deficit. So now the goal here is to basically, approach the diet break again. At this stage, it's still okay to be able to have a 1 week diet break. So 7 days of increasing carbs, increasing calories. So let's go an extra 500 again this time. So that would make it 1700, 2200 to 2150, right? So that would be about, here-ish. Hang on, no, so we're going to be about here. So you notice here that basically, naturally our perceived maintenance is dropping little bit, right? And that's because, your maintenance isn't going to always stay the same. It's adaptive, relevant to your metabolism and to your lifestyle factors, all right? So we've got here diet break, 1 week. Awesome. And then obviously what happens, bam, diet break is done, we're back into a deficit again. So therefore we, at this stage, we're at 1650, and this is where I like to kind of, at this stage, introduce diet breaks a tad more frequently, right? So therefore we're at week 19, so this we just got 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 weeks. So we'll be finishing at about here. There we go. Diet break is finished, straight back into here. So you started back in here at 1650. And at this stage, you might finish at about 1500, right? So by this stage, because someone has been, so we're into a deficit again, 4 week block. By this stage, someone, especially if a female has been doing this properly for this decent period of time, that's enough to have lost a decent amount of kgs, and they should be retaining some pretty serious muscle mass. And then what can happen here is basically, you want to kind of be careful here in terms of going much lower than this, essentially, because that's when you're getting into some pretty low calories. So what we might do here is one more diet break. So we go up to let's go up to 2k, right? So 2k calories here. There we go. So we're getting a bit lower in terms of diet break, but let's just say here 1 week diet break. 1 week diet break. And then this is probably where it would be the last full block of actually eating in a deficit in terms of what awaits next. So now, because we've had a decent amount of time in the trenches of being in a deficit, right? This is probably where it's wise to go on the last probably block of being in a deficit, I'd probably say, before something happens. So let's say 1500, and we are going here, finish at maybe 1400, right? So we'll zoom in a bit more, 1500, and we might finish it at 1400, right? So this is a 1, 2, 3 week block. So in this sort of case, someone has gone through over 20 weeks of dieting. They've essentially been able to achieve some pretty dope results by only really dropping from 2k to 1400. And as you can see here, their perceived maintenance has gradually also dropped as well. It went from over here, and it's gradually gone down, as you can see, which is natural, you know, because as you were aware before, like I said, you've got adaptive thermogenesis, which is in play. So when someone has gone through a timeline like this, and they're now over here, right, obviously what's going to be important next, if we go like this, right, so we're going to look into something now. So once they've finished a timeline like that, this is where it's wise to reverse diet, right? And reason for this is because you've just gone through a full period of time where you've gotten yourself down to fairly lean to the scenario, right? So now what would be wise is to basically, over a period of anywhere between, let's say, 4 to 8 weeks, depending on your psychological factors and how you handle, you know, eating more food and stuff like that, basically over 4 to 8 weeks, increasing from, well, this intake here, which is 1400, to the new maintenance, which would be like, so maybe an extra 400 or 500 calories more, so 1900, right? So to maintenance of 1900, okay? So the bummer here about getting leaner is that, well, as you can see here, when someone is at this weight, they probably might weigh, you know, 70 to 80 kilos, maybe a bit more, let's say 80 kgs as a chick, right? And then, you know, you might be down over here, and you might be somewhere in like the 60s, potentially, or something like that, right? So naturally, because there's less of you as a human, like, yeah, you've gotten stronger and fitter and stuff like that, but because things have kind of gone down, so will your TDEE, as I said before. So naturally, in this sort of case, the maintenance is now 1900 to be able to maintain that weight. But then what you can do to be able to improve this and to be able to, you know, get your maintenance intake higher is then from that scenario, right, you can go into what's called a lean bulk or a bulking phase, where you're basically focusing on, where you're basically focusing on gaining muscle, right? Where what would actually happen, right, is you would have, like, you don't really technically need diet breaks in, you know, when you're trying to gain muscle, but what would basically happen is you would be, whether these 5 weeks of eating in a deficit or whatever, you'd probably have a similar period of time eating in a surplus, and then you might have a 1 week of eating at a maintenance intake, so it's like a slight drop rather than an increase, right? All the way along to keep yourself in check and to minimize fat gain. And then what that does is, obviously, because it increases your lean body mass and overall muscle tissue, obviously you'll keep your weight in check. But what's happening is, because you're adding more muscle, so will, you know, its thermic properties and metabolism boosting properties and stuff like that. So that's a way to be able to gradually increase your TDEE and your overall, you know, energy burn. Like me now, I maintain a nice lean 78 to 80 kgs. And I can maintain that eating at about 3,500 to 4,000 calories, right, which is fucking cool. So hopefully what this has done is it's helped to make sense of a rough timeline. Obviously it's going to be different for everyone. Whenever I coach anyone, obviously it's very personalized according to the timeline we've got to work with, their starting weight, their history of what they've been through and stuff like that. But as you can sort of see, it's essentially, yeah, to just be able to break up the deficit rather than just doing what most people do, which is they don't even work out their maintenance. They just go, oh, the miracle pill is to eat 1,200 calories, so I'll just start way down here. And as you can imagine, it's fairly hard to stick to it, so therefore what will happen is they'll start to go under to try and get results happening, but then it becomes too hard to stick to, so they have a big fucking spike, YOLO, they go right back down again, and they will cruise along on the wagon, bigger fucking YOLO, right back down again. And then what's going to likely happen at about this stage is they'll just give up, right? And then this is when the self-pity kicks in, all this sort of stuff, and then before you know it, they found another diet, and it's basically similar to exactly what went on there, and therefore the same shit is going to happen, right? So the idea of an approach like this that we've just gone through is to be able to make it manageable, to be able to make adherence easier, to be able to look after your hormones, and to be able to not basically bend yourself over and shaft yourself from behind, right? This is the reason why, like, your goal when it comes to fat loss should actually be to be able to approach it eating as much as possible, right? Like, as you can see here, starting out, like, you don't even really need to go that 20% below maintenance to start out. Like, if I were you and you've done your job properly, in terms of like what you did prior to starting. Like you could even get away with just eating at maintenance for a little while, right? Making mad gains with your training, potentially building some muscle, that sort of stuff, and experiencing recomposition before then starting in like maybe a 10% deficit. So in that sort of case, it would be what, 160, I think. Yeah, 2160 or so. No, 2200. And then you would continue along like this, diet break, and it's just going to make things more manageable. So yeah, that's been the first focus of this video. So breaking down the timeline and the periodization behind it. Now let's get stuck into a tad more theory behind yeah, the whole concept of diet breaks and comparing them to refeeds.
If I got $1 for every time you slam the door,
so as you can see, fam, it's pretty sick, the whole concept of basically utilizing diet breaks. Now, when it comes to basically like, literally it can work for anyone, but you've just got to be conscious of the timeline that you've got to work with. So if you plan to basically be dieting for longer than 16 weeks, if I were you, I would be incorporating these diet breaks quite frequently. And then the cool scenario is that, as you would have remembered from me just going through that timeline, once you've gone through a fair amount of blocks, you can start actually incorporating refeeds as opposed to diet breaks to be able to achieve a similar effect. So obviously with diet breaks, as we went through, it's a means scientifically for you to be able to, well, yeah, consume more calories, to be able to reduce the fatigue and the negative impacts that come from deficiting for ages, and to be able to, yeah, like make adherence more manageable and easier. Now, when it comes to refeeds, essentially, what you're doing is quite similar. You're eating to maintenance, but for 1 to 2 days, right? So, scenario would be, let's say that you are, yeah, you've been in the trenches with a deficit for a while, you've lost a ton of kgs, you've maybe been, you know, using diet breaks for a while, and then now it's time to incorporate refeeds, right? So with refeeds, what you do is, rather than having a 1 to 2 week diet break, let's say, for example, that when you start using refeeds, you would be basically essentially doing it maybe on the weekend for when you are more sociable and when you want more creativity and like want to think about, you know, what you're eating and to use those extra calories wisely. So what you would do is you would bump your calories up to almost at maintenance, and ideally you'd be consuming more carbs than, you know, what you normally do in terms of how you go about using those extra calories. You would use more carbs-based food ideally, and then you would return back to your deficit, rinse and repeat. And then as you get leaner and leaner, you can start incorporating refeeds to be twice a week, 3 times a week. And then before you know it, you're pretty much eating at maintenance and you're lean, happy and healthy, and, you know, Bob's your uncle, right? Now the science behind refeeds is to basically keep leptin levels in sync. There are studies that prove that, you know, this is legit. But it's obviously still an untapped area when it comes to studies around athletes and stuff like that. But for a Gen Pop person, obviously what happens for so many people is that because they eventually diet, restrict themselves and undereat so much, naturally the body doesn't want a bar of it. So this is where, to help combat this and the perceived self-destruction, this is where the body will reduce leptin levels to be able to basically, well, fuck up your appetite. And play around with other hormones like ghrelin and insulin and stuff like that, and cortisol. So basically you want to eat the house down, and the idea of sticking to a deficit is all but impossible, and therefore you binge, you YOLO on hyperpalatable foods, calorie dense foods, and yeah, like more than likely bail on the diet that you were doing, right? So to help combat that in terms of refeeds, and this is also what diet breaks do to an extent as well, is they raise leptin levels. And leptin basically is a, yeah, like it's a really important hormone. If you're keen for a more in-depth video on it, you can scroll through the uploads in my channel. A little while ago, sometime back, I did a nice in-depth video on leptin, but essentially from a macro point of view, leptin within your cells and stuff talk to your brain, basically they have cool mad chats with each other, kind of like ET when he's trying to phone home. And it's as if when leptin levels are shit due to restrictive dieting, yo-yo dieting and stuff like that, it's as if the reception is basically barred, right? In terms of your ability of your cells to be able to talk to your brain. And because your brain then can't pick up on what's happening, right? Like naturally your cells will talk to your brain to tell the brain what's happening, you know, how much fat stores there are, how much energy is coming in, like they're both homies, right? So because that reception is barred, what then happens is that your brain freaks out. It thinks that, you know, it's fucking in a famine of some sort, right? And this is when it plays around with your hormones to basically get you to eat, because it thinks that, yeah, there's a lack of fat basically going on. And this obviously happens quite often for people that are very overweight, even though they've got lots of fat. So it's like you can avoid all of this by just learning how to diet smart. So there's a bit of science for you. Really hope that was insightful. Do me a favor, if you're someone who uses diet breaks and refeeds, comment below and let me know your experience with them. If you are new to this whole world of diet breaks, refeeds, flexible dieting, stuff like that, let me help you out. Check out in the link below in my description, you'll see there's a link to my store, and in there you can get amongst a whole heap of sick free materials, some masterclass action, some ebooks, some cheap low cost programs and stuff you can get amongst that will really help you on your journey. And obviously if you are stuck in the game that is fat loss and trying to control how you look, how you feel, how you function, and feel like it's a bit of a pushing shit uphill scenario, and like, hey, my hand goes up for this as well. That used to be me back in the good old days. Like, I've been dieting since I was 14. I've been very overweight before. I've been skinny fat before from doing things wrong, and now obviously I look and feel how I do, and like this guy in the back end, like, I've taken my body to ridiculous heights in terms of applying this stuff, and I just love helping people do the same. So if you find that you're stuck and you would love to get some help, in the link below as well you will see there's a link to coaching information, and that's where you can basically gain some more insight into how I help men and women across the world look great naked, restore their relationship with food, and fucking smash it. But just be aware that when it comes to like making your own food choices and stuff like that, be aware that there is the national dietary guidelines that can help you out, because at the end of the day, like, health matters most. Aesthetics and stuff is cool, but get your health sorted first, then focus on aesthetics. So do me a favor, if you found this video valuable, give it some love, drop it a like, share it with someone who you think could benefit from it. And naturally, when it comes to this whole game, like, if you're keen to see it modeled better and have more contact with me, follow me on social media. My links are just below. You can follow me on Instagram, you can follow me on Facebook. I'm everywhere, baby. And obviously more frequent use on there as opposed to on YouTube, where I only upload 1 to 2 videos a week. And obviously if you're new to the channel, make sure that you subscribe. Would love to have you hang around and check out some other videos. But otherwise, until next time, peace out. Thanks for watching. See you next time in the YouTube world.